Well, why have a talk on the history of Greenpeace? Well, obvious reasons. I'm a Greenpeace activist. I've been invited down here by the Lewes group, and we're directly opposite the building that used to be, in the 1980s, Greenpeace International's headquarters. But beyond all those reasons, I think the reason I started doing a history of Greenpeace was because Greenpeace has an interesting history. If I was doing a history of Friends of the Earth, group of similar size, similar vintage, similar objectives, it will be a history of what Friends of the Earth had done. Because Friends of the Earth is bigger, but otherwise exactly the same as it was when it was formed in 1969. Greenpeace is not the same as it was. It's not the same as it was when it was based here in Lewes. It's not the same as it was 10 years before that. It has grown and evolved and changed, and that's what makes the history interesting. So, how do I know this? Well, this is a younger version of me, 1997, on the sort of first serious thing I did to Greenpeace. It was the first time I'd been to Greenpeace's headquarters to pick up this survival pod. And as I was sat there in the cafe, waiting to be sort of sorted out, just started talking to the random guy who was also sat down in the cafe, having his lunch, and he turned out to be Al Baker from the Greenpeace Actions Unit, who told me about living inside that survival pod for 6 weeks, whilst it was chained to the the rock of Rockall in the Atlantic Ocean, basically living on haddock. And then when he told me that story, he told me about how 2 years earlier he'd been playing hide and seek with the French Foreign Legion on Mururoa Atoll, trying to stop them blowing up an atomic bomb. And he was still on the island when they did blow up the atomic bomb. And I just thought that was the first sort of Greenpeace story I collected. There's plenty more in books I read. And Greenpeace has never really collated its history. Its history exists in the memories of people and to a certain extent in the books they've read. So I'm not in any way, shape or form an official historian either for Greenpeace or anybody else, but I have collected as much of these stories as possible, and I haven't got time to tell you anything more than a fraction of them, but more importantly I've tried to put them together to tell the story of how Greenpeace grew. And I would say there are sort of, well, the question is, when did Greenpeace become the international campaigning organisation it is now? And the question behind that question is, when were all the pieces in place that Greenpeace would inevitably become what it is today? And I would say there are sort of 5 sort of key moments in the history of Greenpeace, and hopefully you'll spot them during the course of this talk. But first of all, a very broad bit of history. The modern environment movement, pretty much you can say, started on this day, 28th of May 1892, when the great-granddaddy of all conservation groups, the Sierra Club, was formed in the United States by the chap on the right here, John Muir. Writer, adventurer, nature lover, absolutely amazing guy. This is actually him 10 years later when... anyone recognise the guy on the left? Teddy Roosevelt, he was President of the United States at that time. He came to what is now Yellowstone National Park on his own to see John Muir, and the two of them went off and camped in the woods on their own whilst he was President of America. But these are, and yeah, 1892 the Sierra Club, 1895 in the UK the formation of the National Trust. There was no wilderness to preserve in the United Kingdom, even in 1895, but instead the National Trust preserved rural environments. And that's what these early environmental groups did. They preserved what was left of the wilderness or the rural environment. And for no real apparent reason, well, at least in John Muir's case, apart from that there were wonderful mystical places worth preserving for their own right. But the modern environment movement pretty much can be traced back to this woman and this book, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, a book that alerted the world to the dangers of pesticides, specifically DDT, but it mentions a whole range of them. And for the first time, when this will be a slow burn success, this book, but throughout the whole of the 60s, it inspired the early environmental movement. And for the first time, the environmentalists were looking at not preserving what was left of the old world, but looking at how modern life, modern technology was affecting the entire world. And the environment movement kind of was an undercurrent to the whole of the 60s counterculture, culminating in 1970, the first Earth Day, which, depending how you count, was the largest ever protest there's ever been. But we're skipping slightly ahead, because we need to move back a year or so and move up to Vancouver, just across the border from the United States in Canada. Because it was so close to the USA, it was a home to a lot of people who were fleeing the United States, either because they just disapproved of the government policies, or they didn't want to get drafted to go to Vietnam, or they didn't want their children to get drafted to go to Vietnam. And so Vancouver really became a sort of epicentre of the 60s counterculture. And also, Vancouver's a North American city, and like pretty much every North American city at that time, there was a plan to drive a gigantic 4-lane freeway right through this downtown waterside area. Multicultural, vibrant area. Only, unlike in pretty much every other city in the United States, protests managed to stop it and preserve the beautiful Vancouver waterfront. And the reason why this is important in the history of Greenpeace is pretty much two reasons. First of all, pretty much everybody who was involved in the early years of Greenpeace was present at these protests. Mostly they didn't know each other, but they were all there. And hence you have to realize that there was this culture of environmental campaigning in Vancouver, which is important because when Greenpeace began, it was not an environmental organisation. Its objective, first of all, it wasn't Greenpeace. A group called the Don't Make a Wave Committee had formed initially by people who were involved with the Sierra Club. Everything starts with the Sierra Club. And they were outraged by American planned nuclear tests on the Amchitka Islands, these little islands that are off the tip of Alaska. And they put out a press release saying that they were going to try and stop these atom bomb tests, at which point the Sierra Club said, nothing to do with us, mate, you're doing this on your own. So they reformed as the Don't Make a Wave Committee. And the core of the Don't Make a Wave Committee were three couples: Dorothy and Ben Metcalfe, Marie and Jim Boland, Dorothy and Irving Stowe. The Metcalfes were Canadians, both journalists. The other four were Americans. Marie Boland was an artist. Jim Boland was an engineer. He'd actually worked on American nuclear missiles at one point before he became disillusioned with the entire sort of military-industrial complex and moved to Vancouver so his son didn't get sent to Vietnam. Dorothy Stowe worked in social care. Irving Stowe was a former lawyer who is now a full-time activist. And all of them were Quakers, rooted in the Quaker tradition of peace and peaceful protest. And they wanted to stop the atom bomb tests, but the Quaker way. In particular by bearing witness. Quaker tradition where you go to something you disagree with, some outrage, and you show your disapproval by bearing witness. Which is easier said than done when the thing you disapprove of is away in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on a remote island. But Marie Boland knew that in 1958, another Quaker, Albert Bigelow, had tried to sail his yacht, the Golden Rule, to the Marshall Islands to try and stop an American atom bomb test there. He didn't make it, but he inspired a similar campaign by the Don't Make a Wave Committee. So they tried to, well, they didn't try, they did. They raised money for this voyage. And these people here, they were all people in their 40s and 50s at this stage. They weren't really part of the 60s counterculture. And when a certain Joni Mitchell rang him up and said, hello, I'd like to go and play at your concert, they thought, are you popular? And signed her up. And so the concert was a big hit. It raised, Philip, he's quite well known as well. It made enough money that they could fund their voyage. And it's called the Greenpeace Benefit Concert. The term Greenpeace came from an activist called Bill Darnell, not someone who normally said very much in meetings. But as the meeting was ending and as it was the 60s and the thing that everyone's going, yeah, peace man, and Bill Darnell goes, yes, and make it a Greenpeace. And someone thought that phrase stuck and they were going to stick it until they made a badge. But in order to get the words on the badge, they ran green and peace together to make one word. So Greenpeace was formed, but it wasn't the name of the organisation. It was the name of the voyage. Now, the boat was actually called the Phyllis Cormac, a old, rickety, very old, very rickety former trawler named after the late wife of the skipper, John Cormac, who did not know what to make of these hippies who wanted to hire his boat. He just thought of a number, how much it was going to cost for them to hire it, and thanks to the Joni Mitchell concert, they could afford it. So the Phyllis Cormac, for one voyage only, got renamed the Greenpeace, and with its crew of 12 activists, it set sail for Amchitka Island. And they didn't make it. Bad weather, poor navigation, and finally intervention by the US Customs ensured that they had to turn round and head home. Greenpeace had, by this time, raised enough money that they were able to charter a second boat, an ex-minesweeper they called the Greenpeace 2. And that too set sail to Amchitka. The two boats sort of passed each other. The Greenpeace 2 didn't make it to Amchitka either, but that was because the Americans knew they were coming and brought the test forward and detonated the bomb before they got there. It didn't cause the tidal waves that they'd feared, but it certainly devastated the island of Amchitka. Now then, we've mentioned the founders of the Don't Make a Wave Committee, the sort of, the older people who were involved with the group. Older being relative, 50 is not old, obviously, is it? But there was also a younger contingent on board, people who were very much channeling the zeitgeist of the times. And that's Ben Metcalfe on the right. Perhaps the most influential, certainly the most influential in the history of Greenpeace, was this chap on the left, Bob Hunter. He was Canadian, although he'd spent most of the 60s living in England, where he'd met a Welsh activist called Zoe, who he married, who introduced him to CND and the British peace movement. He moved back to Vancouver and got a job with the Vancouver Sun, prestigious newspaper. He was very much part of the mainstream media. Well, at least that was his job. In his head, though, he wasn't. And communication was Robert Hunter's thing. And he's an eminently quotable guy. And one of his most famous quotes, one's most relevant to Greenpeace, this one here, plant a mind bomb. And this was an idea he came up with before the Greenpeace voyage. As he put it, revolution these days is a communication struggle. Instead of lobbing bullets and bombs, we're lobbing mind bombs. Revolutionary images that will explode in people's heads. What we might call these days an image that goes viral. And that was his plan for communication. But in his mind, the voyage was a failure. They didn't get to Amchitka. They weren't there bearing witness. They certainly weren't there when the bomb went off. There was no mind bomb as far as he could see. And they, and ultimately the Greenpeace too, headed back to Vancouver, really thinking they'd failed. But they hadn't. The protests against the bomb had been huge in Canada before the Greenpeace set sail. For the first time since the War of 1812, the land border between America and Canada had to be shut. And then once the Greenpeace and the Greenpeace 2 set off, they became the main story. And so these people, they got back to dry land and found that the world had been following them. Plans to wind up the Don't Make a Wave Committee were basically shelved. They were going to carry on and do it all again. But at this moment, they weren't an organisation. They were a kind of a flash-in-the-pan media event. They didn't have roots, they didn't have numbers, they didn't really have any resilience at this point. It was it had been good, but as far as they were concerned, it was more or less over. Except there in a following press conference, someone said to them, "You're just anti-American, aren't you? The French are testing nuclear bombs in the Pacific. What are you going to do about them?" And that's where the next chapter of the Greenpeace story begins. So, French testing atomic bombs above ground, well, not above ground, in the air, on Mururoa Atoll in the Pacific. Quite a long way to go from Vancouver in an old fishing vessel that could do a maximum of 9 knots. So they had to find someone a bit more on the spot who could do the job for them. So they put an advert in a newspaper in New Zealand, and this guy replied, David McTaggart, the world's most unlikely environmentalist. McTaggart lived his life at 90 miles an hour. He whatever he turned his hand to, he was a brilliant success at. Brilliant, incredibly annoying, very irascible, quite a sort of force of nature. He had, when he was young, been a champion badminton player, rated number 2 in the world. Mm. And he said himself, he's got the reflexes to play badminton. That was just luck. But what made him a champion was he was so aggressive when he was on the court. When it was 1-to-1, he could out-psych anyone. Unfortunately, his badminton career was cut short by a road accident. He then turned his hand to the world of business, and he became a very successful developer. Eventually ploughing all his money into a huge ski resort in Canada. Unfortunately, one day it burnt down thanks to a gas leak, and the insurance refused to pay out. He lost his entire business empire. He had just enough money to buy a 30-foot yacht called the Vega, which he took off to the South Pacific on, and basically survived by smuggling expensive watches. So he was knocking around in New Zealand with not a lot to do when his girlfriend pointed out his advert. Now then, probably what attracted him most to the Greenpeace offer was the money. But he says what got to him was, because of these atomic tests on Mururoa Atoll, the French had declared 100,000 square miles of the ocean was a no-go area to shipping. And this outraged the libertarian in McTaggart. The fact that, He'd lost his money, but he had the freedom of the seas apart from this area around Murray Atoll. And so that, combined with the fact that it just seemed such a wacky plan, he had to sign up. He agreed to take the Greenpeace money and sail off to Murray Atoll once again to try and bear witness and potentially stop this atom bomb test. So the crew was McTaggart, Ben Metcalfe from Don't Make a Wave Committee, shortly to be renamed the Greenpeace Foundation in Vancouver, Nigel Ingram and Roger Haddleton, who were both Brits and ex-Royal Navy, and an Australian called Grant Davidson, who didn't know much about sailing, but he was apparently quite an amusing guy and everyone liked him, so they invited him along. And pretty rapidly, things didn't go smoothly. Bad weather didn't help. The 2 Canadians and the 2 Brits both fell out. Now, Ben Metcalfe, he was from the Greenpeace Foundation. He was paying for the voyage. It was his campaign. He was the Greenpeace press officer. He kind of thought he was in charge. But there can only ever be one person in charge on a boat that's got David McTaggart on board. Fair dues to Ben Metcalfe. He pretty rapidly saw which way the wind was blowing. He got off the boat at Rarotonga Island, the last stop before Mururoa, and went and then flew back to France, where he led the campaign from France, and really bigged up McTaggart. He was sure McTaggart would get there, because nobody knew. The Vega was a very small boat, had a very primitive radio. Basically, the radio drained the battery whenever you turned it on. So for most of the voyage, McTaggart and the crew were completely out of communication. Roger Haddleton also got off as well. So it was McTaggart, Nigel Ingram and Grant Davidson that eventually made it to Murray Atoll. Whereupon the French sent out a succession of warships to keep tabs on them and try and scare them off, but they stayed within the blast zone and delayed the testing. Now, McTaggart had been told before he left, if you can see the balloon that the bomb's going to dangle from, then you're far too close. And just to try and scare him off, the French launched their balloon, but McTaggart and co, they stayed there. Eventually, a storm blew them away from the island, and the French were able to get their first bomb test done. But as soon as it cleared, they were back again, and so was the French minesweeper that was tagging them. And these dangerous games can only really have one outcome. McTaggart was in a sailing ship, the French were in a minesweeper. Whoever sailed the minesweeper did not understand how sailing ships worked, and eventually the minesweeper ended up ramming the Vega. Taken on water with the ship sinking, McTaggart had no alternative but allow himself to be rescued by the French. It was a very brave voyage, tremendous achievement, but from Greenpeace's point of view, it was a complete failure. McTaggart was an amazing person, great sailor, but he was not at this point a campaigner, and he made 2 really critical mistakes. Well, 3 if you include the failure with the radio. Firstly, whilst the French were patching up the Vega, he allowed himself to be treated to a slap-up meal by the admiral in charge of the tests. And whilst he was sat down with all these French officers, all in their finest uniform, drinking the finest French wine, eating the finest food, up comes a photographer. Take your picture, please, sir. Click. And France puts out the press release, lost Canadian rescued by the French Navy, but were treating him really, really well. The Vega gets patched up. McTaggart sails back to New Zealand, stopping her once again at Rarotonga Atoll, whereupon he bumps into a journalist who's a little bit suspicious of the French official story and asks McTaggart what really happened. You got any photographs? He did have photographs. But McTaggart was from the world of business, and in business you don't give anything away for free. So McTaggart said nothing, kept hold of his photographs. The journalist didn't get his story. And so the Greenpeace in this case completely lost the press war. If it was a story at all, it was a French Navy story that went out. So McTaggart found himself back in New Zealand. The Vega had been the only thing he owned in the world, apart from a few smuggled watches, and now it was unserviceable. It couldn't sail again without major rebuilds that he couldn't afford. He was not in the best mood. He used the last of his money to fly to Vancouver. He was Canadian. To fly back to Vancouver to basically have it out with the Greenpeace Foundation. And thanks to you, I've lost everything. What are you going to do about it? And this is kind of one of these stories from the pre-internet age. He got to Vancouver and could not find Greenpeace. Greenpeace was not an organisation at this point. They met informally in people's houses. There wasn't even a poster up saying when the next meeting was. No one really, people remembered Greenpeace, but they couldn't tell him where they were. And he literally spent several days wandering around Vancouver trying to find Greenpeace. Eventually, he saw someone in a shop wearing one of the Greenpeace badges, and they eventually put him in touch with Bob Hunter, and he went to go and stay at Bob and Zoe's house. And this was a very important meeting for the history of Greenpeace, but an interesting one. It'd been lovely to be a fly on the wall. Hunter was a product of the 60s counterculture. His leadership style was so laid back, he was practically horizontal. He was everybody's friend. And one of his many quotes was fear power. He believed Greenpeace was an idea that belonged to the whole world. Now even McTaggart's friends said McTaggart didn't really have friends. He had people who were useful to him. I think pretty much his wives would say that as well. He had a few wives. He was not very communicative. He told you what he wanted, and that was kind of about it. And coming from the world of business, he believed in control and organisation. So this was very much, he's also 10 years older than Bob Hunter. This was a meeting of opposites, but actually they got on really well, and they became a sort of yin and yang of Greenpeace. McTaggart, in Bob Hunter's ideas of communication and the mind bomb, saw an idea that could change the world. Bob, in McTaggart, saw someone with the organisational skills he lacked, someone who could kind of get Greenpeace up and on a firmer footing. And so they parted as friends and rejuvenated and with a bit more money. McTaggart went back to the Pacific. And the Vega was made ready for its second voyage to Mururoa Atoll. Now, anyone spot any difference between this crew and the one I showed earlier? It's got women on board. Now then, yeah. Now, McTaggart was an unusual, unlikely feminist. He liked women in the sort of other sense of the word. He married several and went out with far more than that. So with the two women on board, well, there's McTaggart and Nigel from the first voyage. The two women on board were Anne-Marie Horn, who was his then girlfriend, and her friend Mary Lawney. It's worth having a little aside about women in Greenpeace. There have always been women in Greenpeace, and no one really kept numbers, but it's entirely possible that there were always more women in Greenpeace than there were men. And certainly, in the early years of Greenpeace, you find women running most of the branch offices around the world. But if you look at the photographs, you do not see many women. And, beyond the sort of the general sexism of the times, that does take a bit of explanation. I mean, one reason is the three women who helped form the Don't Make a Wave committee didn't really get on with each other. So then they didn't form a faction within Greenpeace. None of them actually wanted to be on the voyage to Amchitka. So they weren't excluded, they just didn't want to go. There were younger women in in Greenpeace, women who were perhaps more in tune with the feminism of the 60s. But because there's a generational gap with the founders of the Don't Make a Wave committee, they failed to form a bond. And I think some of the men involved in Greenpeace admit, that it was complete failure, that they ended up being as sexist and as macho as the military-industrial complex they were campaigning against. So women did start to appear in the Greenpeace Canada story, but here in the Pacific with McTaggart, you have a 50% female crew on the second voyage to Mururoa Atoll. And the women ended up playing a very important role. So once again, the Vega made its way through the storms, got to Mururoa. This time the French, though, weren't planning on playing any games. Almost as soon as the yacht arrived in the islands, the French sent a minesweeper out. The minesweeper launched this small boat called a Zodiac with gendarmes on board, armed with knives and truncheons. They boarded the the Vega and immediately started clubbing McTaggart and Ingram until they were both unconscious. Mary Lawney filmed it all with a film camera. They grabbed her camera, chucked it in the sea. Anne-Marie was taking still photos. Before they could grab her, she ran down below deck, where beforehand she'd placed an almost identical camera on the table in the below decks. She raced down, hid her camera, the gendarmes followed her, saw the camera on the table, grabbed it, ripped out the film, threw it overboard. Everyone was then locked below decks, including the unconscious McTaggart. Whilst the gendarmes weren't looking, Anne-Marie removed the film from her real camera and hid it in, let's just say, a delicate place. The women and Ingram were released fairly quickly. McTaggart, though, had a very serious, well, he had been knocked unconscious, but more seriously, he had a very bad eye injury. He was flown to Tahiti, where the French doctor demanded to be allowed to operate immediately. But McTaggart had learned his lesson from the first time. He refused to allow the operation to go ahead until he got a free phone call. He phoned his brother in Vancouver. His brother Drew was a doctor, so the first thing his brother said is, you do need to get this eye sorted out as quickly as possible. But he told Drew exactly what had happened. Drew sent out a press release, Anne-Marie's photographs went out, and almost immediately the French had sent out their own press release shortly beforehand, saying once again they'd rescued this poor Canadian, but he'd gone a bit psycho and had tried to attack them as their unarmed people tried to board the yacht. But everything's all right and it's been resolved. But almost immediately, the Greenpeace press release went out with the photographs that showed exactly what had happened. And the press story, the big press story this time, New York Times and everywhere else was, France told outright lie, vessel seizure in international waters illegal. Game to Greenpeace this time around. In due course, McTaggart would go to France and take the French to court and win a partial victory. And during the course of the legal action, testing at Mururoa didn't end completely, but atmospheric testing at Mururoa Atoll came to an end. The tests were moved below ground, which even the judge in the French case admitted was largely or entirely the result of the Greenpeace action. So set and not quite matched, but certainly set to Greenpeace in the Pacific. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, these two enter the scene. Dr. Paul Spong was a very highly regarded Canadian psychologist who'd in 1967 got a job at the aquarium in Vancouver, where he met the person on the right, Skarna, a captive orca whale. Now, Dr. Spong had gone to basically conduct a very, very simple experiment on Skarna. Just wanted to test the whale, well, not technically whales, are they, but wanted to test the killer whale's eyesight. So he had a selection of boards. One had a single stripe on, one had two stripes of different distances apart. And the idea was if Skarna tapped the one with two stripes, she got a treat, a fish, and the idea was to see could she tell two very, very close together stripes from a single stripe. And Skarna played the game. She was getting like 80% plus correct answers for this test. Very good for Dr. Spong. And then suddenly the scores plummeted. And suddenly Skarna was getting exactly 0%. She got every one wrong. 50-50 choice, she was getting every single one wrong. Which obviously that's not an accident. You could only get it wrong if you know what the right answer is and you are deliberately picking the wrong answer. So frankly, Dr. Spong was something of an expert in whales, but there's still, and dolphins as they actually are, but there's still the view amongst experts that these were just big dumb fish, just animals, and then suddenly Dr. Spong found this creature was communicating with him, trying to send him a message. So he ditched that experiment and instead just looked at trying to communicate with Skarna. Tried playing music, tried rock music and she went a bit bananas, played classical music and she loved it. He would try resonating the sounds through crystals and, well, he lived in a commune, Dr. Spong, so he just, you can imagine. And eventually he just ended up him sitting with his feet in the water while Skarna just nuzzled him and he even allowed his feet to put in her mouth and just, completely safety. And his only conclusion was, this is an intelligent animal and it wants to be free. And so he put out a press release and got sacked. So he was wandering around Vancouver without a job. And, because everyone does, I think, in Vancouver, he bumped into Bob Hunter as well. And the two of them got talking and Bob, well, the initial plan was to try and rescue Skarna. They could go and send a helicopter in and take her out. And that wasn't going to be feasible. So the next thing was, we know that whales and dolphins are intelligent. Let's at least stop people killing them. Let's take the campaign out and let's try and stop the massacre of these whales, these intelligent creatures. And so Spong and Hunter formed this sort of subgroup of Greenpeace, which they called the Stop Ahab Committee. And so for a while there were sort of two Greenpeaces in Vancouver. There was the original peace faction, And there was kind of the younger people with Bob Hunter and Paul Spong planning how to save the whales. And Greenpeace could probably have split permanently, except that the peace faction sort of ceased to exist. Irving Stowe, sadly, who was really the dominant personality in Greenpeace, died of cancer. The Bolans moved off to an island to start a farm, and the Metcalfes went back into journalism. So by default, Paul Hunter and his and then Bob Hunter and his Stop Ahab committee became Greenpeace. So the next thing was, how do you actually do it? The tactics were Bob's idea, pantomime bomb. Another one of his great phrases, put your body where your mouth is. So the French had used this little boat called the Zodiac to board the Vega. So that was where what they're going to go. They're going to rehire the Phyllis Cormac, load a couple of these small Zodiacs on board, and then use them to interrupt the hunt. One Zodiac would go out and get between the harpoonist and the whale. The other one would film. They practiced that, sort of turned themselves into bikers of the sea. That was the easy bit. The hard bit was going to be finding the whales, finding the whalers, because the ocean is a very, very big place. Fortunately, Dr. Spong was still a very well-connected and respected scientist, and also the whalers didn't know they were coming. So Spong used his connections. He again, the pre-internet age, he had to actually physically travel, I think, from Quebec to Iceland until eventually to Norway, where he was granted access to the archives of all the whales that had ever been. So he walked into the Dragon's Den in Norway, a place where they'd invented the exploding harpoon, found all these records, and he could see patterns to the way that they operated. Now, the Phyllis Cormac wasn't a very long-range vessel, so they couldn't, just tour the world hunting the whalers. But he found out every August the Russian whaling fleet was about 60 miles off the coast of California, on the Mendocino Ridge. And so that was their plan. The Phyllis Cormac was rehired, the Zodiacs were loaded, a new crew, including some women, was collected, and off they sailed. And using a mixture of high and low tech, they eventually tracked down the Russian whaling fleet. The high tech being the radio direction finding equipment, which they used to first of all, they tuned into the Russian voices on the radio and followed them. And when that conked out at the last minute, as technology tends to do, they reversed to the I Ching and started casting the sticks. Fortunately, the I Ching came up trumps, and they intercepted the Russian whaling fleet. Now then, so I'll play you a little clip. You're going to hear from Rex Whaler, a US draft dodger who'd moved to Vancouver and became first president of Greenpeace, which is when the Make a Wave Committee renamed itself, and Paul Watson, who we'll come to in a moment, but significant activist. And this is their story.
Coming upon a floating slaughterhouse. There's blood in the water. There's huge slabs of blubber being hauled up on these big factory ships. Blood is just pouring out of this pipe, and the stench alone made us all want to throw up.
Suddenly, Bob and I were in a small boat in front of a Soviet harpoon vessel that was bearing down on us. In front of us was 8 magnificent sperm whales that were fleeing for their life, and every time the harpooner tried to get a shot, I was at the helm, so I would maneuver the boat to try and block the harpoon.
And the harpooner's not shooting, but eventually somebody from the bridge walks down the catwalk and talks to the harpooner, and the harpooner nods and the guy goes back, and Bob looks in his eyes and he knows this guy's going to shoot this harpoon.
Then he looked at us and smiled and brought his finger across his neck, and that's when I realized Gandhi wasn't going to pull through for us that day.
And at that very moment, they fire the harpoon.
And this harpoon flew over our head and slammed into the backside of one of the whales, and she screamed. It was a very human-like scream, like a woman, and it took us completely off guard.
The whalers purposefully shoot at a female first because they know that the bull whales will attack them. And then when the bull whales come to attack them, which is exactly what happened.
He was waiting for him and very nonchalantly pulled the trigger and sent a second harpoon into the head of the whale, and he screamed and fell back, and now the water is full of blood everywhere from the 2 dying whales. And as this whale lay and rolled in agony on the surface of the ocean, I caught his eye and he looked straight at me.
And we're looking into the eye of this huge sperm whale, and I have to tell you, it's sort of beyond emotional. You know, there's certain moments that are so emotional, you're just in brand new territory. We're coming upon...
Yeah. And whilst that was going on, it was being filmed from the second Zodiac. Just as a harpoon was fired, the film spools come to the end of the film. They have no idea whether they actually got the shot or not. So they immediately had to break off the action, sail back to shore, find someone to develop the film, and they'd got it. Immediately given to the news organisations, and that image of the harpoon, the whale, the Zodiac went around the world. Bob Hunter had got his mind bomb, the first of many. The Greenpeace whaling campaign continued. They took on the Japanese whaling fleet, the Icelandic whaling fleet, and then next year they went up to Newfoundland to try and stop the annual seal hunt. And this is when the Greenpeace story starts to get a few tensions coming along. I mean, there's been arguments and bickering all the way along. This is when it gets serious. When the team had arrived in St Anthony in Newfoundland, they were met by an angry mob gang of sealers. Sealers are fishermen in the winter. And the Greenpeace plan had been to put dye on the seal fur, making it useless, making it worthless, and the fishermen were up in arms. They were holding up a fake gallows and rocking the van, and all looked a bit tense. But then the Greenpeace agreed to have a meeting in the town hall, and the tension kind of completely went when they checked into their B&B, wondering if they'd be allowed in. And the very friendly Mrs. Decker said, "Oh no, a deal's a deal. Come on in, love, and take your feet off, your boots off." And so, led by Bob Hunter, Greenpeace agreed they were not going to dye the seals, and they were not going to campaign against the cull by the fishermen of St Anthony. Instead, they were going to get helicopter out to the ice floe, and they were going to take on the big Norwegian companies doing the commercial cull. That deal did not go down well with everybody in Greenpeace. In particular, the chap on the left, Paul Watson, was outraged by it. He thought they should just damn the torpedoes and targeted everybody who was killing seals. That tension continued until a few years later, Paul Watson left Greenpeace and formed his own organisation, the Sea Shepherd, which carried on campaigning in the manner of Greenpeace, but under Paul's command. Both the sealing campaign and the whaling campaign continued. The next year, McTaggart sent some reinforcements from Europe in the form of Bridget Bardot. Her first animal rights action was organised by Greenpeace. When pursued by a massive press pack, she arrived in Canada to join the campaign. And once again, Bob Hunter had his mind bomb. The images went round the world. And Greenpeace was now starting to go around the world as well. In 1977, a number of people, many of whom were either currently working for Friends of the Earth or had recently stopped working for Friends of the Earth, formed Greenpeace UK. And almost immediately they looked to buy their own ship so they could go and do their own actions. And they ended up buying this one, a former Aberdeen trawler by the name of the William Hardy. It was bought as opposed to all the previous Greenpeace ships that were rented. This was the first ship Greenpeace actually owned outright. Then it was named the Rainbow Warrior. Now then, why it's called the Rainbow Warrior is, not as simple a story as it's made out. When Bob Hunter had gone on that first Greenpeace voyage, he'd been given this book, Warriors of the Rainbow, by a sort of travelling troubadour he'd met. Warriors of the Rainbow claims to be a story of Native American myths, including the story of the Warriors of the Rainbow, who would be a multi-ethnic group of people who would come together at a time in the future when the air was unfit to breathe and the water was unfit to drink and would save the world. Unfortunately, that is not a Native American story. The book was written in the 60s by evangelical Christians, essentially to evangelise and convert the Native Americans. Susie Newborn, daughter of a murdered Argentine diplomat, one of the founders of Greenpeace UK, had seen this book. Bob Hunter had showed it to her. And it's her suggestion that the ship becomes the Rainbow Warrior. Greenpeace's most famous ship, on its first voyage, it went off to go and take on the Icelandic whaling fleet, the people who'd won the Cod War. On its second voyage, it went up to the Orkneys and was successful in permanently stopping the annual Orkney seal hunt. And it continued on many other voyages. But all was not well in the world of Greenpeace. Bob Hunter wanted Greenpeace to be an idea that went out to the world. Anyone could form a Greenpeace group, and they did. But almost all the work of Greenpeace was being done by the Greenpeace Foundation in Vancouver. And their expenses were they were racking up debt. They were $160,000 in debt. You'd have to add at least another naught to that to get the current figure. Other Greenpeace groups were successful in raising money, but weren't spending it. So there was a cash flow problem around the Greenpeace world. And there were really only two ways that could go. There were two solutions. Either the Greenpeace Foundation in Vancouver starts, creates a franchise, says we are the originals, you must pay us to use our name. Or these disparate groups, some of whom were just like one person, would have to somehow be moulded together into a single organisation. Which one do you think they did? They did the first one. Greenpeace Vancouver sued Greenpeace San Francisco for using the name Greenpeace. Greenpeace San Francisco countersued Greenpeace Vancouver, saying, how dare you accuse us of not being Greenpeace? We are Greenpeace. And all was set for Greenpeace versus Greenpeace, the trial of the century, when David McTaggart sailed over from Europe to basically bang heads together. McTaggart had formed groups in France, England, Netherlands, and embryonic groups in other countries. And they were under the very loose umbrella of Greenpeace Europe. He proposed Greenpeace Europe gets expanded to Greenpeace International as a way of managing this chaos. And it was reluctantly accepted. Reluctantly because with 3 Greenpeace groups in Europe, 1 in New Zealand and only 2 in North America, Canada and the USA, the balance of power would move from North America to Europe. And McTaggart would become leader of it all. Patrick Moore, who we'll call Pat Moore, so as not to confuse him with the astronomer, was not totally happy, but he was bought off by being given control of the original Greenpeace in Vancouver, effectively for life. And I'm not going to say much more about him, but he would eventually leave Greenpeace and become a paid climate change denier. Yeah, that's why I'm not going to mention anything more about him. Yeah, so this is Greenpeace International. They posed for the photograph and then they passed the spliff around because it was still that sort of organisation. Where was Greenpeace International based? Lewes. Who said Lewes? Who bases an international organisation in Lewes? No, this is Amsterdam. Amsterdam, Holland, liberal country. That wasn't the reason they were in Amsterdam. The reason they were in Amsterdam was that 2 years earlier, David McTaggart had got on an aeroplane, saw a woman he really fancied, asked her where she lived, she said Amsterdam, and he said, that's a coincidence, I'm basing my new organisation in Amsterdam. After a couple of years, though, it did move. And it moved to... No, it didn't, of course not. No. Washington, D.C., where the President of the United States lives. Obviously. Anyone ever told you you're a bit self-obsessed, Lewis, Meanwhile, campaigns continued. The Rainbow Warrior got itself arrested by the Spanish Navy because Spain wasn't part of the International Whaling Commission. There were essentially pirate whalers operating out of Spain. So Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd by this time tried to stop it. The Rainbow Warrior got imprisoned. It escaped. They captured it again. They removed an important part of the ship. Greenpeace had the bit remade. They snuck it back into the harbour. This weighed 60 kilograms, part of the propeller. They used to go out and get trashed every night, bit of a Greenpeace tradition, and they'd stagger back in the early hours of the morning. So one day, someone was staggering slightly more than usual, almost as if he was carrying a very, very heavy weight. They'd got the original plans of the William Hardy and had got a company in Britain to secretly remake this thrust block, the bit that was missing. So under cover of nightfall, they refitted it to the ship and snuck out under cover of darkness and managed to evade the Spanish Navy and Air Force and get back into action again. Yeah, and the whaling campaign continued, and politically, progress was starting to be made bit by bit. There was some whale species were exempt from hunting. The cold harpoon, the non-exploding harpoon that frequently wounded or maimed rather than killed whales, was banned. And the tide started to turn against the whalers. until at the meeting of the International Whaling Commission in Brighton in 1982, an agreement was that commercial whaling would effectively be banned. There were caveats. It wouldn't happen for 4 years. There'd be exemptions for scientific whaling. Norway would ignore the ban completely. But commercial whaling had come to an end. No more whale species were to be hunted into extinction. It was a huge victory for Greenpeace, and pretty much Greenpeace alone. McTaggart, who by this stage had bought himself a lovely cottage in Rodmell, just down the road from here, was busy celebrating when he had a phone call from one of the Greenpeace lawyers at International, who was, having a bit of problems. He was in the middle of moving Greenpeace's headquarters from Amsterdam to... No, not Lewes, Geneva. Big international organisation had their big international headquarters in Geneva. So so this guy had loaded all Greenpeace's files into a van and was busy trying to take them to Geneva. But when he got to the French-Swiss border, the Swiss wanted to charge customs duties on these load of old files, and he wasn't prepared to pay them. So he rang up David McTaggart, who was at the IWC in Brighton, and he said, "Oh, I'll tell you what, no problems. I've got an empty barn at my place. Go to Dieppe, ferry to New Haven, turn left, we'll just deal with it later." And so the Greenpeace files arrived in this barn in Rodmell, at which point it was decided, we may as well leave them here. Let's put our HQ in Lewes. Yes, finally. just across the road, literally across the road. And that's where Greenpeace was for the rest of the 1980s. So what happened at Greenpeace International at Lewes? Well, bit of a history lesson first of all. The 70s had been called, quite rightly, the decade of the environment. Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, ban on DDT, a whole load of legal protections for the environment around the world. At the end of the 70s, President Jimmy Carter, even put solar panels on the White House. Come the 1980s, though, very different political landscape, mainly thanks to these two. Reagan took the solar panels down. Mrs. Thatcher, never an environmentalist. And a lot of the bigger environmental organisations kind of saw the writing on the wall. They saw the greed is good corporate attitude of the 1980s. And they frankly got into bed with the corporations, which was not good. The little chap at the bottom here, this is one of the saddest and most unbelievable stories from this sort of sad and barely believable part of the history of the environmental movement. He's an Atwater prairie chicken. A group called Nature Conservancy, who were, by this time, they'd overtaken the Sierra Club and were America's biggest old-style preservationist environmental organisation, received a donation of land from ExxonMobil oil company. And because they decided, well, it was in the contract, that there was oil beneath the land, so they planned to drill for oil and use the money to pay for the reserve that would save the Atwater prairie chicken in this part of America. In Texas it was, and it didn't work. The chicken got white. The chicken became extinct in that area because Nature Conservancy had drilled for oil. Greenpeace did not sell out. They were very much swimming in the opposite direction. And really, the campaigns coordinated from the office here in Lewes were amongst, well, I think they were Greenpeace's most successful to date, and I think some of them you could say were Greenpeace's most successful of all time. The idea of the Greenpeace International was, well, first of all, sort out the funding situation, secondly, sort out the organisation and the bickering. There's always been a lot of bickering, but also to plan more strategically. Instead of being, in front of the harpoon, blocking the pipeline, dealing with the consequences of environmental problems, the aim was to look more upstream. Political action, getting things banned at source, so you don't create the problem in the first place.
That's Brent Spa that I went up.
That's the Brent Spa, indeed. Yeah. Because the Brent Spa was the last act in a campaign that basically ran from pretty much when Greenpeace moved to Lewes here. The campaign to basically stop us dumping all our crap in the sea. The first campaign and the first victory was stopping the dumping of radioactive waste, which was dumped off in the sea, especially off the end of Land's End. Everything was dumped. Technically, it was low-level nuclear waste, but Greenpeace knew from inside sources everything went in there, including spent fuel rods from from nuclear submarines. So once again, say the same tactics that were used in the whaling. The ships would go out there, usually the Rainbow Warrior. They'd launch the small boats. They weren't Zodiacs, they were now rigid-hulled inflatables. And they would try and stop the barrels of waste being dumped into the sea. And sometimes the barrels hit the ship, hit the boats, and toppled the crew into the sea, which made fantastic television. And I can definitely say, as a young man, my first time I saw Greenpeace on TV was either this action or a very similar one. The campaign against dumping in the sea had an almost immediate victory when in 1983 there was a voluntary moratorium on dumping radioactives. In due course, there'd be similar voluntary followed by legal restrictions on incineration and dumping of various toxics. The final loophole that needed to be closed was old industrial units, old oil and gas infrastructure like the Brent Spar, because there were dozens of these structures due to be disposed of at sea, and they were technically exempt from what was now becoming from 1992 was regulation on toxic dumping. So when Shell wanted to dump the Brent Spar at sea, Greenpeace occupied it. John Major offered Shell the use of Britain's the Royal Navy and the Special Boat Service to get you off it. Shell, though, threw in the towel. Not straight away, but the British government was left embarrassed that Shell had caved in before them. And that really closed off a dozen years, 13 years of campaigning against dumping of toxics at sea. Not complete. Well, as far as the ban still stands. There's pressure to start to ocean incineration and everything else, but the ban still stands. A success for Greenpeace and yourself.
John Carter sealed himself in.
Oh yeah.
That was amazing.
Yeah, Shell, you were all removed, but Shell did it themselves in their own security, didn't they? I think John Castle was the last one to get off.
Yeah.
And people talked about the Greenpeace, the Greenpeace, the slick Greenpeace media machine that they completely outwitted Shell. The media machine was a guy called Hans and a radio, wasn't it?
Groups got involved as well.
That was the Lewes group.
Yes, and not just Greenpeace. Greenpeace groups have protested at Shell Garage, and not just Greenpeace groups. Other organisations got involved, including some slightly spiky German organisations that firebombed two of them. But yeah, once again it was another mind bomb. Greenpeace was a global media sensation, all coordinated by Hans and his radio. Yeah, but it wasn't a flash in the pan. It wasn't Greenpeace deciding, oh, we're going to do this today. It was a product of 12 years of campaigning coordinated by Greenpeace International to go line by line. Radioactive dumping first, because that was the easiest story to get the press about, followed by the incineration, followed by the toxics, easier to do actions on. Finally, the dumping of the used infrastructure, which required something big and iconic to happen at a time they could intercept it. The planning that goes into these campaigns, and ultimately seizing opportunities, and then finally having the volunteers and with the skills and the bravery and experience to go and do the action. So this is obviously a much more sophisticated campaign to the gang that went out in 1975 to deal with the whales, but you can see it's an evolution. It's the idea, the mind bomb, the boats. You just add in McTaggart's organisation, and the extreme. On shore, Greenpeace did have a slick media campaign with cutting edge technology to get these images around the world. International also had to deal with some slightly more tricky problems. Who remembers this campaign? Yeah, that's the problem.
I've got one
Right.
of those leaflets at home.
Yeah, 1984, Greenpeace UK started an anti-fur campaign. David Bailey did the photographs, and there was a film that became an advert that was very, very powerful. Now, by 1984, animal rights was sort of quite a mainstream cause in the UK. But it wasn't elsewhere in the world. And other Greenpeace groups thought this was too radical, it wasn't Greenpeace, we shouldn't do it. And groups in Canada and Denmark with the connections to Greenland were doubly unhappy because they had good relationships with the native indigenous communities who survived by hunting, small-scale hunting, but still hunting. So this was not a popular campaign outside of the UK. So the deal was, just run it as a UK campaign and we'll forget about it for the rest of the world. Unfortunately, it was a very good campaign, it won an award, and the film got syndicated around the world, causing a backlash within Greenpeace, which unfortunately resulted in basically the complete board of Greenpeace UK being removed and replaced with people who could be trusted to play ball a bit. It was a successful campaign. I mean, fur pretty much disappeared from the high street, but one that had consequences. And, you know, the downside of an international organisation is you have to have a certain amount of lowest common denominator coordination. But perhaps the biggest event, incident, crisis that had to be dealt with from Greenpeace International in Lewes was this. 10th of July 1985, 3 days after Live Aid, when the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour, getting ready to go for another campaign against French nuclear testing in Murray Atoll, was sunk in the early hours of the morning by 2 bombs.
I was there as well.
You were, where actually were you? When, yeah,
There.
on shore or on the ship?
No, but we went on a ship, but I can't remember which one it was now. Some lemon, a little green one, I think.
Yeah. The explosion, the second explosion, killed Fernando Pereira, Greenpeace photographer. Born in Portugal, he'd walked and hitchhiked to the Netherlands to avoid being conscripted into Portugal's then seemingly endless colonial wars. He became a photographer, he became involved with Greenpeace, he was dedicated to the Greenpeace cause, but he's also a family man. His oldest child, his daughter, was 8 in 1985, and he promised, you know, he'd do his 6 months tour, then he'd be coming home. And she said when he went away, she waved at every aeroplane that flew overhead, you know, in the hope that one of them had her father on board. She actually helped to paint the rainbow on the Rainbow Warrior before it set sail. But the second explosion trapped him below decks, and he drowned. And Greenpeace was lucky, really, that there was only one fatality. There's a myth. Well, it's more than a myth, it's propaganda, perpetrated that the bombs were not intended to kill, and if everyone had got off when the first bomb went off, they'd have been all right. But this was the hole left by the first bomb. It blew open 2 cabins that should have had 4 people sleeping in them.
So who are they bombed by?
We'll come to that. There should have been 4 people in those cabins. They would have been killed or drowned immediately. The second bomb went off, took out the propeller. The only reason there was a 5-minute difference in the time they went off was simply, we believe, the length of time it took the divers to move from planting the first one to planting the second one. So these bombs were, if not intended to kill, at least reckless in what they were done. And suspicion almost immediately fell on the French, except even David McTaggart said, they can't have been that stupid, could they? But, you know, pretty rapidly the New Zealand police arrested 2 people who, though travelling on Swiss passports, were speaking French. They'd been returning their camper van. They also drew the suspicions of a yacht, the Uve, again, with 4 people on it, 4 men on board who spoke French. That yacht was briefly detained in Australia. Forensic tests were carried out, but they had to release the suspects before the results came back, and the yacht disappeared. France denied everything. Under pressure, they admitted that they had French agents in New Zealand, but that they were monitoring the Greenpeace vessel. Although within 3 weeks of the bomb happening, David McTaggart met under a street lamp in Paris a rather nervous Dr. Xavier Maniquet, who introduced himself as an expert, medical doctor specialising in diving accidents, who had been taken to New Zealand by a team of French secret agents just as backup. And he was not a secret agent, he was just a medical doctor, and his conscience had got to him, and he pretty much told McTaggart everything that had happened. At least 3 teams of French secret agents had been there. The 2 that got arrested had been logistics carrying the boat that was going to be used by the divers. They got arrested because they were getting the money back on their camper van. if they'd just left it by the side of the road and got an aeroplane, they'd have been fine. So either the French Secret Service was like very, very strict on claiming expenses, or they were fiddling their expenses and they were going to keep the money when they got it back. But that got them arrested, and they were eventually unmasked by French journalists as a captain and a major in the French Secret Service. The Uve crew were never caught, because subsequently it turned out the yacht, which had been the New Zealand police had alerted every police force in the world to stop this yacht. It met a French nuclear submarine in the middle of the ocean. The yacht was scuttled, and the final team, the team that actually planted the bombs, they'd gone skiing on North Island and managed to leave New Zealand 10 days later under false passports. But pretty rapidly, the French story of denial unravelled. And France had to admit that, yes, their agents had bombed the Rainbow Warrior. They had killed Fernando Pereira. We subsequently discovered the operation had been authorised at the highest level by President Mitterrand, although that was never publicly admitted, and instead the Defence Secretary ended up taking the rap and having to resign. It was a spectacular own goal by the French. They had to pay compensation to Greenpeace, to Fernando's family, and the New Zealand government. But more importantly for Greenpeace, the public sympathy led to an influx of members and donations and basically worldwide sympathy for Greenpeace and its cause. And Greenpeace really moved from a shoestring operation to a well-funded and well-organised international group. I mean, before the Rainbow Warrior bombing, it was not unusual as you went to a Greenpeace office to find someone sleeping in it because they couldn't afford rent. Sometimes the Rainbow Warrior had to go and put someone ashore to go and get a job in a factory for a few days just to raise enough money to buy food for the crew. After the Rainbow Warrior bombing, there was enough money to people who were properly salaried, boats properly equipped, and it really changed the organisation, and really, has not looked back since. And the funding from this increase in membership and global support allowed Greenpeace to carry out its most ambitious plan yet. Its plan to make the Antarctic continent into a world national park. Now, the plan had actually started before the Rainbow Warrior was bombed. This ship, the MV Greenpeace, had been fitting out in Hamburg for the first Antarctic voyage when the Rainbow Warrior was sunk. And it was very, very rapidly had to set sail for New Zealand, take over as the leader of the fleet, opposing the French bomb tests. And because of that, and because of unseasonably bad ice, the MV Greenpeace never actually made it to Antarctica that year. But the next year, it was our winter, Antarctic summer, 1986. The MV Greenpeace again set sail. This isn't actually a picture of what happened, but it's a good illustration. This ship that was not in any way ice rated, that had a hull that was in places 1/4 of an inch thick, whilst making its way to the Antarctic, suddenly found itself surrounded by pack ice that would crush it like a grape if nothing was done. The crew basically grabbed broom handles and were trying to fend off the icebergs, whilst meanwhile they cranked up the helicopter to get ready to evacuate everyone to safety. But then almost as rapidly as the ice had formed, it dispersed again, and they managed to get to the Antarctic continent and carry out their ambitious plan, which was to leave a base with volunteers inside over winter in Antarctica, and the next summer they'd come back, swap the crews over and carry on. Now, whilst they were down there, they would be researching the wildlife, they'd be researching the pollution, the massive amount of pollution that's being caused by the big international bases in Antarctica. And perhaps more importantly, because Greenpeace now had a permanent presence in Antarctica, Greenpeace could join the Antarctic Convention, which was the meeting of all the nations that had bases in Antarctica and who were basically squabbling for ownership of the continent, ready for mining companies to move in. And these missions were not cheap. Each one cost $1 million, $1,080,000. Greenpeace had funded the first mission by, Ted Turner, German TV company, a few dollars here, a few dollars there. But they weren't going to win this campaign in 1 year. What the influx of money following the Rainbow Warrior bombing did was it allowed Greenpeace to continue these missions, and actually for the third voyage they could afford to buy a proper ice-rated ship, one that wouldn't immediately sink if it was trapped in the ice. And so winter after winter these occupations continued. Meanwhile, back in Lewes, David McTaggart was coordinating a political response. And once again, it's quite sophisticated. There were a number of countries trying to muscle into the Antarctic mineral rights, and the plan was to tackle them all one by one. Chap on the top left, who was he? Exactly. Who better to lobby the French not to agree to Antarctica becoming a national park? Chap on the top right? Peter Scott. Who better to lobby Britain? Very important to lobby Britain because following the Falklands War, the United Kingdom had a large air base right on the edge of Antarctica. Absolutely perfect if you want to start exploiting the continent. United States, though, big player, so they got
Al Gore.
young Al Gore. Yep. Now, America was vulnerable because the Greenpeace World Park base was right next to America's McMurdo base, which was right next to a huge pile of toxic waste, which they'd been documenting. So America could be very obviously shown to be not being good custodians of the Antarctic. And of course, this was the Cold War. And of course, the argument always goes, well, okay, we're nice, we won't mine in Antarctica, but what about the Russians? And so, and this is really something McTaggart made a big play for in the last years of his life. Greenpeace made overtures to the other side of the Iron Curtain. You know, McTaggart became friends with Gorbachev. Greenpeace released albums, fantastic albums of wonderful 80s bands in Russian, in behind the Iron Curtain. It kind of brought rock music to the communist bloc for the first time. And Gorbachev, being the nice guy that he was, immediately supported the campaign. And so politically, things were starting to come together. And I think it was, timing is so crucial in these things. If Greenpeace had started this campaign any earlier, the money would have run out or wouldn't have been there in the first place. Had they left it any later, the opposition would have got a say. Because in 1988, all the companies that were planning to mine Antarctica came together and formed the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Reserves. And by regulation, they meant mining Antarctica. So that was 1988. 1989, though, the bottom right incident happened. The Exxon Valdez. Other end of the world in the Arctic, but a oil tanker struck a reef off the coast of Alaska, and tens of thousands of tons of oil polluted this virgin wilderness. And nothing could be done because of the emergency location, and so this image of this oil polluting this wilderness, beautiful wilderness, for days on days, went around the world. And the political impact of all that was, in 1991, a convention was agreed that Antarctica was going to be a national park effectively, and for 40 years it would be a natural reserve devoted to peace and science and no mining. So on the 10th of February, after 5 years, the Greenpeace presence in Antarctica was wound up, having won a victory. The treaty still stands, the Antarctic is still not mined, and hopefully never will be. One continent, at least on Earth, remains unpolluted. A bit warmer than it was, but not actually polluted. Even, I think that's Greenpeace's biggest victory ever. I think that still stands.
Amazing.
Well, better start wrapping it up. So many stories to tell. Kings North Power Station action, 2007. Perhaps more importantly, Kings North Power Station trial, 2008. Greenpeace were accused of criminal damage, claimed not guilty as the power station was cause of causing damage, defended by James Hansen, scientist, Zach Goldsmith, scientist, and the activists found not guilty. Pretty much ended coal-fired power in the United Kingdom. Yeah, no doubt about it. October 2013, the biggest crisis in Greenpeace's history since the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior.
This is the Arctic.
Whoop, 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 whoop. Yep, shut up, Peter Capaldi. Right. The Russians seized the ship Arctic Sunrise with 28 Greenpeace activists and 2 journalists on board and stuck them in prison facing charges of piracy, which would have at least 10 years in prison. For the first time, Greenpeace was effectively dealing with a hostage situation. Greenpeace took advice from the veteran journalist Martin Sixsmith, who said 2 things. 1, don't negotiate. The Russians only respect strength. 2, don't target Putin directly. So Greenpeace effectively went to war with Russia, well, Gazprom. Basically doing all the things that Greenpeace does. Whenever Gazprom had an event, they sponsored a football match, they sponsored a yacht race, they sponsored Greenpeace did a protest. The Winter Olympics were due to be held that year in Russia. It was implied, but not stated, that they would be a target as well. And in the end, Putin folded. The activists were released, initially on house arrest, and then eventually allowed to flow home. And a year later, the Arctic sunrise followed them. It was a crisis. It was a serious situation. It was resolved as far as the crew got home. Wasn't at that stage a victory, but it was part of the broader campaign to stop drilling in the Arctic Ocean, the main target of which were Gazprom's allies, Shell. And that's what this next video is going to be, I think. Oh, no, it's not. No, it's not yet. But yeah, and yeah, I will take some questions.
This is the Arctic.
There we go. Shut up.
There is the ball of fire, growing and rising above the clouds and smoke from the explosion. This mushroom cloud is certain death to any living thing which approaches too close to its end.
I was born in 1971, and thanks to people like you,
Phil Ball's one of the
Greenpeace
Arctic
first set
30.
sail to prevent nuclear testing.
The most dramatic attack on whaling in recent years has come from the Greenpeace Foundation. Its small volunteer navy launches rubber boats into the midst of the whaling fleets, trying to disrupt the hunt and save the whales.
I was born in 1982, when Greenpeace and people like you stopped commercial whaling.
Yo nací en 1993, cuando Greenpeace y gente como tú prohibieron los desechos radioactivos en los océanos.
I was born in 2002, when Greenpeace and people like you stopped illegal logging of mahogany in the Amazon.
Mon fils est né en 2012, l'année où Greenpeace et les personnes comme vous ont convaincu les grandes entreprises technologiques à abandonner le charbon. Clean air! My granddaughter was born this year.
And so there we are, virtually up to date, the current Rainbow Warrior. So Greenpeace has evolved. There were certain moments when it changed, certain moments when it could have changed and gone differently. And you could pick a number of different dates of being when Greenpeace became the organisation we know today. But I think the Greenpeace's official birthday, the day that the first Greenpeace voyage set sail, still stands as a good birthday, because I think the Greenpeace has always been about ships. And I think more generally than that, you can say Greenpeace is kind of like a ship. If you're on board a ship, if you're crew, you know, you can be an individual, but you've all got to pull together. And that's what it's like being on a Greenpeace action. You're disciplined. You know, we all work together. But the ship itself can go wherever it wants to. It can go to the Arctic, go to the Antarctic, and sail up a river. And that's what Greenpeace is like. You know, in Greenpeace, you do what you're told, but Greenpeace itself does not do what it's told. You know, Greenpeace, you could say, like a ship, is a communist on the inside and anarchist on the outside. And that's what it really feels like being a Greenpeace volunteer. And thank you very much for listening and being a wonderful audience. Thank you.